está abrindo o quarto Colóquio Internacional do Núcleo Estudos Fiscais, aqui da Direito TV, com a presença do professor Avi-Yonah, da Mission Law School. E eu queria passar imediatamente a palavra para o professor, para o nosso diretor, nosso querido Dean, Oscar Vilhena, para que ele fale um pouquinho sobre o projeto da escola, o objetivo da escola. Na verdade, o núcleo existe, esse trabalho que nós realizamos existe, esse grupo de pesquisadores imenso aqui existe, graças a um perfil dessa escola que produziu uma grande ruptura no direito, uma preocupação em não simplesmente interpretar as normas, mas em produzir políticas públicas, realizar pesquisa empírica e, especialmente, colocar o direito como um instrumento do desenvolvimento nacional. Então, esse colóquio retrata bastante isso, é uma grande preocupação nossa em estar identificando qual que é a melhor regulamentação para a tributação internacional no Brasil, que é um grande gargalo, que é o tema dessa primeira tarde. Amanhã nós vamos discutir transparência fiscal, que é um outro tema muito importante, uma tendência mundial do Open Government. E, por fim, o terceiro painel vai ser um projeto que nós estamos trabalhando sobre a Receita Federal, com a preocupação de identificar gargalos na Receita Federal, de modo a melhorar a Receita e melhorar o diálogo entre fisco e contribuinte. Como diz o título aqui, há uma grande preocupação nossa em montar quadros futuros de uma agenda positiva entre fisco e contribuinte. Nós acreditamos efetivamente que a melhor forma de mudar as instituições é mudar as pessoas que participam das instituições. Então, para nós, os agentes fiscais, procuradores, promotores públicos, agentes públicos são pessoas chaves para que nós possamos fazer uma grande revolução positiva no sentido de implementar e melhorar as instituições rumo ao desenvolvimento nacional. Então, eu queria passar a palavra agora com muito orgulho ao nosso diretor, Oscar Vilhena, da Escola de Direito, para que ele desse as boas-vindas e falasse um pouquinho também nessa nossa preocupação com o direito de desenvolvimento, esse foco da escola, o que está acontecendo aqui dentro dessa escola, que é um movimento muito especial e que merece ser muito divulgado para todo o Brasil e para todo mundo. Oscar, por favor.
Obrigado, Eurico. Bom dia a todas e a todos. É um imenso... boa tarde, desculpa. Boa tarde a todas e a todos. É um imenso prazer estar aqui com vocês, especialmente para abrir esse colóquio internacional promovido pelo NEF. Não é o primeiro, eu acho que eu tive a oportunidade de participar de dois anteriores, se não me engano, não na condição de diretor, mas na condição de partícipe desse seminário. Bom, o Eurico me pediu para que falasse alguma coisa sobre, afinal, o que tem de diferente, qual é a proposta que essa escola tem e em que medida esses projetos, como o que ele e que o Isaías vem coordenando dentro dessa escola, se encaixam numa agenda de direito e desenvolvimento, né? Então, para isso, eu vou pedir só um minutinho para que vocês possam compreender a própria instituição na qual hoje vocês se encontram, né? Não sei se todos sabem, o nosso ilustre visitante, de que a Fundação Getúlio Vargas ela começa a existir no início dos anos 40, não como Fundação Getúlio Vargas, mas como um conjunto de institutos e escolas voltadas à modernização do Estado brasileiro, né? Nós tivemos um presidente Getúlio Vargas, que quando chega ao Rio de Janeiro, depois da Revolução de 30, ele percebe que o Brasil sequer tinha estatísticas, tá? Muito menos estatísticas confiáveis, tá? Percebe que não haviam operadores com muito treinamento na esfera de gestão pública. Então, começou a criação de uma série de unidades voltadas a treinamento de pessoal, a produção de dados agregados, né? Que muitas vezes nós nos beneficiávamos dos dados dos nossos interlocutores internacionais, né? Então, um banco que vinha aqui se estabelecer, ele tinha alguns dados sobre a economia brasileira que a própria economia brasileira não tinha. é assim que surge um conjunto de instituições que, depois da morte do Getúlio Vargas, vão ser agregadas nisso que se tornou a Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Nesses mais de 60 anos, a Fundação criou um conjunto bastante consistente de institutos de pesquisa. Quer dizer, hoje ela é vista dentro do Brasil como a principal produtora de informação a respeito não só da economia como da gestão pública no Brasil, e depois ela vai criar uma série de escolas. Então nós estamos numa organização que ela é um pouco peculiar, porque ela não é uma universidade, ela não deseja ser uma universidade, ela deseja ser sim o principal centro de produção de conhecimento na esfera de humanidades, em alguma medida no Brasil, uma instituição que busca produzir esse conhecimento com um objetivo claro, que é contribuir para o desenvolvimento da sociedade brasileira, que tem escolas. Então, ela é um grande think tank com escolas de nível superior, né? Mais do que uma universidade. E qual que é a agenda central dessas diversas instituições da Fundação Getúlio Vargas? Nós tivemos agora no nosso encontro de planejamento estratégico entre os diretores, eu achei muito divertido o nosso presidente, Carlos Ivan Simons Leal, dizendo que nós somos agentes de mudança, né? E que a Fundação Getúlio Vargas tem um compromisso em mudar, né? Evidente que isso é uma agenda perigosa e aberta, mas o sentido que ele atribui a essa mudança é de que o Brasil se torne cada vez mais democrático, que o Brasil se torne cada vez mais justo, que o Brasil tenha uma economia cada vez mais sustentável, né? Nesse sentido, a Escola de Direito tem uma contribuição enorme a dar, né, para essa agenda de um avanço na democracia, uma agenda de avanço na justiça e uma agenda de avanço na sustentabilidade social, econômica brasileira. Sem dúvida nenhuma, a Escola de Direito é um elemento que eu diria quase que pivô dessas relações, porque tudo isso se faz, qualquer que seja o projeto político do Brasil, ele depende de uma compreensão normativa, de um refinamento normativo muito grande, no qual nós somos os que conhecem essa besta nos detalhes, né? Afinal, economistas têm grandes perspectivas sobre como deve ser o direito, mas quem conhece o direito no detalhe, normalmente somos nós que operamos esse direito, e da mesma forma, nós somos aqueles que arquitetamos e, em alguma medida, operamos também no detalhe as instituições que aplicam o direito, né? Então, qualquer que seja o projeto de desenvolvimento, ele tem que passar necessariamente por uma esfera normativa e por uma esfera institucional, no qual os que se encontram hoje nessa escola têm uma preocupação fundamental, né? Portanto, ela não se vê como uma escola que simplesmente busca ser uma intérprete de uma normatividade existente, mas uma escola que seja capaz de aferir a qualidade da normatividade existente e, sobretudo, de mensurar o desempenho das instituições responsáveis por implementação dessa normatividade existente. Nisso, ao meu ver, é uma ruptura com as escolas tradicionais do direito, pelo menos da escola da onde eu vim, onde a nossa missão era conseguir extrair sentido das normas que estavam dispostas em algum documento normativo. Essa era a formação do jurista, é a formação daquele que é capaz de compreender uma outra língua, de compreender algumas regras da gramática dessa outra língua e conseguir traduzir para o leigo o que significa em termos binários, se aquilo é possível ou impossível, se aquilo é legal ou ilegal. Essa escola, ela busca ir além disso, busca compreender se essa normatividade ela é boa, se essa normatividade contribui para quê, onde estão os problemas dessa normatividade, quais são as deficiências das instituições que têm responsabilidade por implementação dessa normatividade. Evidente que essa é uma tarefa de risco, né? Tudo que não é tradicional significa que você corre risco, você pode ser mal interpretado, você pode ser julgado, e nós não temos o menor medo disto, né? A única preocupação é de fazer da melhor forma possível, e é isto que os nossos colegas do NEF vêm fazendo, e um pouco desta agenda que está aqui disposta é uma representação. Quer dizer, o problema que ambos são obcecados, o problema da transparência, né? De que forma as relações entre cidadão e fisco, se não são relações ideologicamente superáveis, eu acho que nunca vão ser, né? Como tentar resolver aí, eu lembro do Papa João XXIII, que queria resolver o problema da luta de classes, né? É um pouco difícil, a não ser que nós acabemos com as classes, né? Da mesma forma, é evidente, é só acabando com o fisco ou o contribuinte que as tensões necessárias vão se dissolver. Mas existem pontos que podem ser de interesse mútuo e, portanto, que nós podemos avançar. O tema da transparência é um tema fundamental, né? Que é evidente que os maus, como diz a presidente Dilma, os malfeitos, né? Os malfeitores. Evidente que malfeitores detestam transparência, mas benfeitores, em geral, acham que a transparência é um mecanismo fortíssimo para reafirmar a sua condução, a sua condição de autoridade, assim como ela é um elemento fortíssimo para aqueles que contribuem, saibam o que está acontecendo com os seus recursos. Então, malfeitores de um lado e de outro não gostarão, mas benfeitores de ambos os lados terão enorme simpatia por uma agenda de ampliação da transparência, né? Que não é uma agenda só brasileira, é uma agenda internacional relacionada com a democracia. Bom, eu falei demais para quem não entende nada de direito tributário, mas também não falei nada de direito tributário. Eu queria só desejar boa sorte a todos, agradecer imensamente ao professor Avi-Yonah, que nos visita, também agradecer imensamente aos diversos de vocês que vêm de muitos lugares, especialmente da Receita, com quem nós temos trabalhado há bastante tempo em diversos projetos, né? Temos, inclusive, um curso de pós-graduação específico para a Receita, né? Abrimos agora um mestrado profissional em Direito dos Negócios, Direito Tributário, e eu participei intensamente desses debates. Havia uma expectativa de que fosse um direito tributário voltado aos negócios, voltado aos advogados de negócio, e nós mudamos a condução desse mestrado para que ele seja um mestrado voltado também para a área pública, também para os profissionais que atuam dentro da Receita. Então, eu agradeço a presença de todos vocês e passo a palavra à presidência ao doutor Eurico, e infelizmente eu vou ter que me retirar, que eu já tinha um outro evento, tá bom? Obrigado, viu? Até logo.
Eu gostaria de passar a palavra para o professor Isaías Coelho, para que faça a apresentação do professor Avi-Yonah. Mas antes eu gostaria de fazer a minha costumeira apresentação do professor Isaías Coelho. O professor Isaías, nós chamamos de I-Prophet, é o nosso profeta, é o profeta e o guru do nosso núcleo. Ele tem esse jeitão, acho que ele odeia que eu fale essas coisas, mas ele tem esse jeitão de caipirão, assim, de quem veio do interior, uma pessoa simples, quieta. Mas Isaías foi o primeiro colocado no concurso de ingresso da Receita Federal do Brasil, ajudou a montar e a implementar a Receita Federal no Brasil, foi responsável por elaborar o LALUR, escrever junto com o Bulhões Pedreira o Regulamento do Imposto sobre a Renda, implantou a Tributação Internacional, do Mercado Financeiro de Capitais, aqui no Brasil também, com toda uma equipe da Receita Federal. Depois foi para Washington e ficou 20 anos no FMI, fazendo reformas tributárias em vários países do mundo. E depois de ter realizado uma série de missões, voltou para o Brasil e nós tivemos a honra de receber o professor Isaías no Núcleo de Estudos Fiscais, que tem sido uma fonte de inspiração inesgotável para todos nós. Nos traz textos de ontem, que o Vito Tanzi acabou de escrever, já manda para ele, já manda para nós no Núcleo, nós já começamos a ler, começamos a estudar. Então, Isaías deu vida, deu modernidade, deu sofisticação ao nosso pensamento e uma nova perspectiva de mundo para nós. Então, eu queria, antes de tudo, fazer uma reza aqui de agradecimento pelo padecimento do professor Isaías, e que foi o professor Isaías também. O nosso primeiro colóquio, nós recebemos o professor Richard Burt. No nosso segundo colóquio, a convite do professor Isaías, veio o professor Vito Tanzi, um grande especialista do Banco Mundial. No terceiro colóquio veio um outro convidado, o professor Isaías, que é do Daniel Chavido, da NYU. E agora nós temos a honra de receber o professor querido Avi-Yonah, também amigo e convidado do professor Isaías. Professor Isaías, por favor, apresente o nosso keynote speaker.
Obrigado, Eurico.
Vai falar que eu exagero sempre.
Bom, já nem vou dizer mais nada. Né? Olha, com muita alegria que eu dou as boas-vindas a todos os que estão aqui hoje, no início desses nossos 2 dias de trabalho e de reflexão sobre temas do direito tributário e da complexidade tributária, que vai muito além do direito, que é uma matéria certamente multidisciplinar, com ramificações na economia política, na ciência política, até na filosofia. Então, é algo complexo e difícil, mas que requer todo o nosso trabalho para avançar. O nosso programa, portanto, vai se concentrar nesta tarde nos aspectos do direito internacional e nos aspectos dinâmicos, não de como ele está disciplinado nas leis dos países, mas como os países estão envolvidos no processo de reforma e quais são as tendências. E, para isso, nada melhor do que ter conosco o professor Avi-Yonah, da Universidade de Michigan, que é uma das pessoas mais ilustres nessa área de conhecimento. Além de ser um grande amigo do Brasil, tem muitos amigos aqui, muitos estudantes, né? E nós, ex-alunos dele, e então nós abrimos a porta aqui para ele com grande alegria, e sem mais demora, passo a ele a palavra para fazer uma apresentação. Entendo que o professor Avi-Yonah vai falar durante algum tempo e depois deixar um espaço para discussão. Não sei se esse formato é adequado, Eurico. Não está aqui. Sim? Sim. Quer dizer, quanto ao formato da discussão, se nós faríamos, talvez, logo depois da apresentação do professor Avi-Yonah, uma sessão de perguntas especificamente sobre a reforma, sem prejuízo de que depois da rodada, durante o processo de rodada de discussão, nós voltemos ao assunto, inclusive com a participação dele, tá certo? Para ficar um pouco mais dinâmico, para não ficar somente uma aula expositiva. Antes de continuar, queria registrar a grata presença aqui também do professor Luiz Eduardo Chueri, que junto com a doutora Simone Musa e com o doutor Cabni Rulo, né, compõem a nossa painel de discussões, que vão também apresentar suas ponderações. Tudo isso num ambiente de diálogo em que a participação das pessoas aqui presentes será sempre bem-vinda. Então, sem mais delongas, o professor Avi-Yonah, por favor.
Muito obrigado. That's more or less the extent of my Portuguese, I'm sorry. And I will try to speak slowly for the translation, which is a problem that I also have because I tend to speak a little fast, but I will try to slow down for this purpose. So first of all, I want to thank, and especially Professor Isaías and Professor Eurico for inviting me and having me here. And it's a great pleasure to be back in Sao Paulo. I was last year at a conference organized by Professor Shueri 2 years ago, and this is probably my 6th or 7th visit to Brazil in the last 6 or 7 years. I try to come here every year if I can, and I love this country, and I love the people that I meet here and the students that I have from here. So it's a great pleasure to be here again. And in addition, you've got me lovely weather. It's, you know, about -5 degrees now where I come from, so and there's snow on the ground, so it's nice to have a break. The topic is tendencies in international taxation, and this will be the background for our panel discussion a little later. So I want to step back a little bit and talk about the role of globalization and its impact on international tax, and then I will go a little bit more into detail about how it impacts the development of tax rules and what has changed, especially in the last few years since the financial crisis began in 2008. So the current era of globalization, which dates from around 1980, is characterized by the greater mobility of capital than labor. On the one hand, we have immigration restrictions and other difficulties that makes it relatively difficult for people to move from country to country, although I'll come back to this at the end and ask whether this is changing as well. But let's say compared to the 19th century, where there were no immigration restriction and we also had globalization, it's more difficult now. On the other hand, with capital, because of the development especially of electronic means of transmission, everything can be sent overseas by the click of a mouse. So we clearly have a lot of ability by both wealthy individuals and by big corporations to shift their capital from one country to another relatively easily. And this has led to significant challenges, especially, and this is what I want to focus on, to the income tax, both the individual income tax and the corporate income tax, because, of course, the big difference between an income tax and a consumption tax, for example, is that it seeks to tax the earned return on capital, whereas a consumption tax basically only seeks to tax the return on labor. So those are where the challenges lie. So let me talk about both of those in turn. So as far as individuals and the individual income tax are concerned, one trend that has happened, and this already happened, I think, in the early days, is that after countries started liberalizing their rules about exchange controls and the ability of individuals to invest and to move money overseas, they usually followed that with a switch from territorial basis taxation, that is only taxing income that is derived from sources within that country, to global or worldwide taxation, because otherwise it's too easy for the rich to move their capital overseas and legally escape tax. So this has certainly been the trend all over Latin America. It's been a trend in Israel, where I come from, and it's been a trend in other countries as well, the adoption of personal basis taxation. Unfortunately, though, that is not enough, because the key question, as was mentioned by the Dean earlier, is how to actually implement and enforce such a tax. It's not enough to have a tax on the books. And usually the income tax domestically is enforced by one of two means. One is withholding at source. When you get paid wages, there's withholding. Or there is information reporting. In the United States, for example, we rely heavily on banks and other financial institutions reporting the information that they have over people's earnings over to the tax authorities. And this will be a topic for tomorrow's discussion about transparency and so on. The problem is that when we go international, neither of these means is readily available. Following the liberalization of exchange controls, most countries that were source countries, that is, that were destination for investments followed the lead of the United States and abolished withholding on payments to foreigners in order to draw investment. We, in the US, adopted the so-called portfolio interest exemption back in 1984, and this, it's well known, resulted in a huge influx of what's called capital flight from all over Latin America to banks in Miami and other places. And there is no withholding, and until recently, no collection of information at all. So that is one problem. And the other problem is the problem of information, which will be a major issue for later and especially for tomorrow, because generally speaking, it is possible to set up shell corporations in various jurisdictions around the world, and the income is then earned in the name of those shell corporations, and in the absence of exchange of information, real exchange of information, or any kind of way to overcome bank secrecy, then it is not possible for the residence country to know that this shell corporation is actually beneficially owned by somebody who's a resident. So you can have a situation, for example, where somebody in the United States sets up a shell in the Cayman Islands. That shell in the Cayman Islands then opens a bank account with UBS, let's say, in Zurich, and then the money is invested through the UBS account back into the United States, and payments are made to that account which is held in the name of the Cayman corporations, and there is simply no way for the tax authorities, or the bank for that matter, to know that this is actually owned by an American, and therefore that it should be subject to taxation. Because if it was a real foreigner, then our rule is real foreigners, there's no withholding tax. But if it's an American, they're supposed to be taxed. So that's problem number one. And that relates mostly to individual tax. And of course, you will notice that this is essentially a problem of tax evasion. It's illegal behavior. Under our rule, and under the rules of most countries, this income is subject to tax. And it is subject to tax even though it may be formally the income of the Cayman Corporation, because we, like most countries, have rules that currently tax income earned through so-called incorporated pocketbooks. That is, you can't escape tax just by setting up a corporation, and you can do that. If you look at the back pages of Economist magazine, every week they advertise offshore corporations. I mean, it's very cheap to set up something like that. You don't have to travel to the Caymans or any other jurisdiction like that. And it's very easy, and there's nothing real there. There's a famous building in the Caymans that is home to 82,000 corporations, most of which are owned by Americans. So this is all very easy to do. It's illegal, but it is very hard to enforce. And I once gave testimony in the US Senate trying to guesstimate what the amount is for the United States, and I guessed something like $50 billion lost a year, which is real money, even though it's, I think, small compared to the amount that other countries may lose to this. Your previous speaker, Vito Tanzi, estimated already back in the 90s that $7 trillion of interest income is untaxed worldwide, and this was a long time ago. I would suspect that the figure now is much bigger than that, although because it's illegal, nobody knows for sure. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is corporate tax, and there we have the advantage that it's all legal. That is, corporations don't usually avoid or evade taxes. They avoid them legally by using loopholes in the law. And the main loophole here is their ability to earn income through controlled subsidiaries. So the typical structure is that you have a parent corporation in a capital exporting country like the US, let's say. It sets up a subsidiary in some low-tax jurisdiction, like, let's say, Ireland or Singapore, and that holding company in turn owns subsidiaries, second-tier subsidiaries, in various high-tax jurisdictions where the products that the corporation develops are sold. So we have three, in this simplified structure, we have 3 jurisdictions involved. We have the residence jurisdiction of the parent corporation. We have the location where the production of the goods take place. And nowadays, the highest value added usually relates to intellectual property. So it really is where the IP resides, and this is what you put in the low tax jurisdiction, that most of the value is added. And then there are the jurisdictions where the goods or the services are delivered to consumers. Now, the problem here is the problem of tax competition, and that is because of the increased mobility of capital. Multinationals are much more mobile than they used to be. It used to be like when a company like our own General Motors or Ford wanted to set up a factory in Brazil, you know, they came and they set up the factory, and that certainly enabled Brazil to tax them, because once this factory was set up, it was here and it couldn't easily escape. So these companies actually pay a lot of taxes. But nowadays, if you look at companies like Microsoft or Google or Intel or Apple, the value is mostly in the IP. And even when they manufacture something like computer chips, those are very small. And in addition, the technology is advancing so fast that you need to open a new factory every 2 years or so. And so the result is that it's much more difficult to catch these companies in one particular place. And so as a result, you've had competition from countries all over the world who want to attract this investment. And the companies know this, and so they conduct auctions, and they make a list of acceptable countries to them from the perspective of location, political stability, labor force, infrastructure, education, and everything else that they care about. But even if they make a list of all of these things, there's still more than one country in the world where you can get everything that you need. And so they go to these countries and say, you're on my list, what will you give me in order to make me come here? And the usual answer is, we can cut taxes, because that's the one thing that we have immediate control of. And so the result is that the multinational doesn't pay taxes in that country at all for a long period of time. And so this is what happened to most source-based taxation of multinationals in the location where they produce the goods or where the IP is located. They typically pay very little tax there. As far as distribution of the goods is concerned, that is less subject to tax competition because the market is not so movable. But what has also happened is that it is, under modern conditions with, for example, electronic commerce, easier to sell goods into a country without having a physical presence there. And the tax treaties, which are, of course, old and date back to the 1920s and 1930s, generally forbid a country from taxing a foreign company unless it has a physical presence or a so-called permanent establishment in that jurisdiction. So as a result, it becomes more difficult to tax the company on in the places where it distributes the goods or services as well. And finally, the residence jurisdiction where the parent is located also are subject to tax competition, because a lot of countries have so-called headquarters regime, which seek to attract the headquarters of multinationals to come there, because that goes usually with good jobs and research and developments and other positive externalities, as the economists would say. And so the concern of the capital exporting countries has always been that if they try to impose too much taxes on a residence basis, their multinationals will simply go away and become multinationals based in some other country. So that's the second problem, which is that multinationals pay little tax, or a lot of, especially the high-tech type multinationals pay little tax. There's been hearings recently that I also testified in the U.S. Congress, documenting the level of tax that is paid by companies like Google and Apple and Microsoft, and it's typically very low. It's way less than 5% on their overseas profits. So why is this a problem, you may ask? I mean, what's so bad about this? Well, I mean, I tend to believe that we should tax both individual income and corporate income. This is a contestable assumption. I mean, I know that there certainly are economists and some lawyers who believe that the whole world should only rely on the value-added tax and nothing else, and we don't need to tax income. But I believe that we should, primarily in the case of individuals because of progressivity issue, fairness issues. That is, individuals do meaningfully reside in one place and do meaningfully belong to one society. And if we can't tax income, that just means that everybody will pay the consumption tax, and of course the rich consume much less as a percentage than the poor, and the tax base becomes much more regressive. As far as corporate tax is concerned, I don't think this is so much an issue of fairness, although there is an issue of leveling the playing field between purely domestic companies and multinationals. But the main issue there is that the corporate tax, in my mind at least, has primarily a regulatory function. But if companies can escape the corporate tax by moving overseas, then it's impossible to regulate their activities as well. And the result is that they are able to escape regulation. And since they're very important players in the world economy, that is an issue or a problem in my mind as well. So what can be done about this? Well, in recent years, especially since the crisis of 2008, there really have been some very important and interesting developments in both of these problem areas. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit now, and I'm sure we'll go much more into those in the discussion that follows. So first, for individual taxpayers, there's been a concerted push post-2008 to get the tax havens of the world to participate and to enter into exchange of information agreements. The OECD has set a bar that unless such countries have 12 exchange of information agreements in place, they will be put on a blacklist. As a result, all of them, as far as I know, have basically now become cooperative in the sense that they have 12 agreements in place. I frankly don't see that as such an important development, because if you look at the actual agreement, first of all, it's not clear that they're implemented, and second of all, they are very limited in scope and value. In particular, they almost never provide for any kind of automatic information exchange. The residence country needs to have already information about which of its residents may have money in those places in order to go and make a specific request. You can't engage in what's called fishing expeditions. And so I think this is actually of relatively limited value. The more important developments, I think, are the ones that have taken place really recently. And the first one is a unilateral move by the United States that is known as FATCA, and you probably all have heard about it because this has global implications. Now, I have to admit, mea culpa, that I was one of the originators of FATCA to some extent, at least in the sense that it came from legislation that Senator Carl Levin from Michigan proposed called the Curb Tax Havens Abuse Act, and I was involved in drafting that, although it had a lot of stuff in it that did not make it into the final bill. But basically what FATCA does is that it says that, first of all, that vis-a-vis the United States government, U.S. residents and citizens don't have a right to privacy. That is, they're supposed to disclose their information. It's illegal not to. And therefore, what they say is that when a foreign institution, financial institution knows or has reason to know that some of its depositors are Americans, it has the affirmative obligation to disclose that information to the tax authorities in the United States. And the penalty for not doing that is to put a withholding tax on the income of the institution itself. So this only works for institutions that have a business presence in the United States, but the reality of the world is that almost every financial institution, every big one at least, has sufficient business presence in the United States that the penalty is meaningful, and you can see that from the numerous complaints that foreign financial institutions have been making about FATCA, that this has real bite. So I think that this is promising and that other countries will probably follow. I mean, it does raise a lot of issues. Just to raise one obvious point, what if the domestic law in the host country like Brazil, where the foreign financial institution is based, prohibits the disclosure of that information? Then the bank is stuck between two legal commandments that are directly in opposition to each other. And what do you do in that situation? So we can talk about that. Another problem, in my opinion, is the fact that the United States uniquely taxes its citizens even if they live permanently overseas. And a lot of these bank accounts are by people who have no intention to evade taxes in particular, but they simply live here. And if they actually live here, it makes perfect sense for them to have their bank accounts here, and yet they are still subject to the rule. In my opinion, we should change our law to stop taxing citizens living overseas, but that's a different issue. So that's one development. Another important development, which also happened recently, is that in order to avoid having a situation like FATCA where you're obligated to exchange information, Switzerland has entered into agreement with the UK and pending with Germany, and it's trying to do it with other countries, where what they do is that when a Swiss bank knows that it has, let's say, British depositors, it will collect 30% from the income of those accounts and send it over to the British government, but without disclosing any information. It is anonymous withholding. That's an alternative model. The Brits are happy with it because they get the money, which is what they're concerned about, but on the other hand, they don't know the information, and we can discuss which model is better. I don't think this will work in the United States. I mean, we care too much about actually knowing what people have as a fairness matter. We don't just care about the revenue, but we can discuss this as well. Then, on the second problem, that is the issue of multinationals, there have also been interesting developments. And this is, I know, a very hot topic in Brazil, and a lot of the questions for discussion in the panel will be about that, because you really have a somewhat unique rule for taxing the controlled foreign corporations of your multinationals, i.e. you tax everything on accrual, which is unusual. But what I want to say from a global perspective is that I think there's been a tendency for significant convergence in this area recently, and countries seem to be moving towards what is a workable model. If you look at countries that have adopted so-called CFC rules, controlled foreign corporation rules, recently they all more or less follow the same trend. And I was in China last week, where they have the newest set of CFC rules, and they also have precisely that. So what most countries seem to do now is that they separate out between situations where there's a real investment. And by a real investment, I mean something like the GM and Ford factories in Brazil, that is something that is really located in a country. And for that kind of income, they not only don't tax it when it is earned, they also don't tax it when a dividend is repatriated. So they have an exemption system for that kind of income. On the other hand, for mobile or financial income or passive income, investment income earned by multinationals, they tend to tax it currently under the CFC rules. And the way this works basically is that they have a rule that explicitly makes the taxation contingent on the effective tax rate in the host country. So there's some kind of cutoff, and what you say is that if the effective rate in the host country is over X percent, let's say 10% or 15%, or maybe sometimes it's some percentage of your residence tax rate, but there's some cutoff. If it's above that, then it's okay, because deferral doesn't give you that much of a benefit if you pay source country taxes. But if you benefit from a tax holiday, if your tax rate is very low, then the CFC rule kicks in. And there's various ways of doing it. You can do a blacklist of bad countries where the tax rate is low. You can do a white list of good countries where the tax rate is high. You can try to calculate the tax rate country by country, etc. All of those are variations of the same theme, but the basic common denominator is that countries tend to apply CFC rules in situations where there is no source-based taxation, and there's no real presence in the host country. And this, I think, in our American case, would catch Google and Apple and Microsoft and so on, because what became clear from these hearings is that they all essentially concentrate their entire profit in places like Ireland, and they pay 4% or less effective tax right there, and there's no real presence there. I mean, what is supposed to be there is the IP, but the IP is not really present anywhere. So I think this kind of rule would catch them. And so this is now the kind of proposal that is made in the United States, and I think it has a pretty decent chance of passing. Our current rules unfortunately date back to the early 1960s, and they're hopelessly obsolete. They essentially assume that if you have, quote, active business income in some location, and this includes royalties and stuff like that, then you will be subject to tax there, which is simply not true. So I think that this is where things are going, and this will go a long way to solving the second problem as well. So by and large, and let me conclude here, I think that things are looking quite promising from the perspective of enforcing cross-border taxes on capital. I think on the individual front, more progress has been made in the last 3 or 4 years than in all the years since countries started opening up. These things are too new to really know the effect, and it's very hard to estimate these things because the behavior is illegal, but nevertheless, I think that some of these developments are quite promising, and certainly they are groundbreaking in the sense that the Swiss, for example, have never before either given out information or agreed to withhold. The whole idea that you withhold for the benefit of some other country is a deviation from the century-old revenue rule that countries don't collect taxes on behalf of other countries, and this is a major departure from traditional conceptions of sovereignty and the like. So finally, let me just say a couple of words about the whole fundamental assumption of capital and labor mobility. So I've talked a lot about taxation of capital, and it is my view that even though capital is quite mobile, it's getting harder and harder to escape tax on it if these kinds of rules are put in place, especially on the individual side. On the other side, though, you have labor mobility, that is the ability of individuals to move from country to country. And here I think the assumptions of the economists are somewhat obsolete. And in a 21st century world, I'm not sure that they're true anymore. Because, first of all, they all talk about immigration restrictions, but the reality of the matter is that over 10% of the American population and about 10% of the EU population were born in other countries. So it's not so impossible, and I, of course, myself immigrated to the United States, so you can do it legally or illegally, but it's not so difficult nowadays, and there are many other countries in the world, I think including Brazil, which has a lot of migrants to it. Second of all, the income tax, of course, is primarily a tax on the rich. A very high percentage of it, at least in the US, is paid by the top 10% of population. And those kind of people in particular find it easy to migrate from country to country because most countries really tend to welcome rich migrants. And so what I think we are seeing is more of a tendency for people to actually move. And some of this movement may be in response to tax rates. So the famous story here is Eduardo Saverin, who's Brazilian originally and was one of the founders of Facebook. He's the one who lost out in the social network movie and was cheated by Zuckerberg. So he only got a 1% share in a $100 billion company. So he's merely worth $1 billion. But famously, he moved to Singapore and abandoned his American citizenship before the IPO. Before Facebook went public, and so saved a lot of taxes on the value of the shares. And I think if you look, the US State Department publishes the numbers of Americans who give up citizenship, and it has tripled in the last few years, even though we're still talking about less than 2,000 people a year. But nevertheless, it is, I think, highly significant. So what's the bottom line? Well, I think if that's the case, and if we believe that maybe it's not true anymore that capital can escape taxes and that labor cannot, because if you move, you generally escape all taxes. I mean, in our case, we also have to give up citizenship, but generally speaking, if you move to another country and really live there, you pay taxes to that country and not to the country where you came from. And that's true for consumption taxes and income taxes and all payroll taxes and so on. So, and I think that that's legitimate. This is people's choice. I mean, they move to countries and they get the benefits of the services in the new country, which is geared to the level of taxation in that country. So my conclusion from that is that the whole trend that we've been seeing, you know, based on the old assumptions that you should tax capital at low rates and labor at high rates is simply wrong. I think the rate should be the same throughout, but I realize that this is a very controversial proposition, so I will stop here and see if you have questions, because you can talk about this forever. Thank you very much.